Well, happy to be here. So, I'm Laura Brocklebank. I work here at UCL. Basically, I'm in charge of implementing accelerometry, and by that I mean activity monitoring, into ELSA for the very first time. So I'm going to give just a very quick background as to why it's important to include an objective measure of physical activity and sleep in large cohorts such as ELSA. So if you compare accelerometry with self-report, adherence to the moderate to vigorous physical activity or MVPA recommendations is substantially lower. So in the health survey for England, around 38% of participants reported meeting these recommendations, so reported doing around 150 minutes of MVPA per week. But those same participants also wore an activity monitor, and according to that objective measure, only 5% actually met the recommendations. Something very similar was seen in the US, so in the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, 50% said that they met the recommendation, and again, only 5% actually did. And then if we go on to think about the health benefits of MVPA, the maximal risk reduction for the association between accelerometer-assessed MVPA and all-cause mortality is considerably greater in magnitude than for self-reported MVPA, and it's also observed at considerably lower levels of MVPA. So what I'm sort of wanting to get across here is that basically using a self-reported measure of MVPA in large cohorts such as ELSA might be underestimating the importance of physical activity for health and for aging. So here's the ELSA timeline. So up until now, we've had a self-reported measure of physical activity in all waves. We've also have a self-reported measure of sleep disturbances at waves 4, 6, and 8. So in this current wave, we're keeping those self-reported measures because I think it will be very, very interesting to have that comparison. But we're also including wrist-worn accelerometry for the very first time. So I'm going to talk you briefly through the accelerometer protocol that we're using in ELSA. This is very similar to the protocol that's used in the UK Biobank. So we've used the Activity AX3 wrist-worn accelerometer. So basically, this is a triaxial accelerometer. What I mean by that is that it measures acceleration, or it measures movement, in 3 axes. So up and down, side to side, front to back. It was set to record at a frequency of 100 Hertz and a dynamic range of plus or minus 8 gravitational units for people that know a bit more about accelerometry. Participants were instructed to wear it on their dominant wrist where possible. If they couldn't wear it on their dominant wrist for an injury or something like that, then they were told to wear it on their non-dominant wrist. And they were told to wear it 24 hours per day for 8 days and nights. So I should say here that with accelerometers, there's many different types of accelerometers that can be worn on different parts of the body. But it's now most cohorts are leaning towards using those on the wrist because they're a lot more comfortable to wear continuously, particularly at night. So yeah, they wore it continuously for 8 days and nights. Now, ideally, we were meant to be having, I think, nurse visits at wave 10, and the plan had been to give these monitors to participants at the nurse visit. But obviously, COVID ruined everything, so these monitors were actually distributed via post rather than in person. So this threw up some sort of practical complications, because instead of setting the monitors to start recording immediately, we had to set them to start recording 2 working days after postal dispatch, and then we just had to hope that there were no postal delays. And then, so they were set to start recording 2 working days after postal dispatch at 10 a.m. and to record for 10 days rather than the typical 7 days. So we had those 3 extra days to allow for postal delays. So participants were posted the monitor that you can see at the top there, and they were also posted this activity monitoring postcard. So they received their monitor and their postcard. They were instructed to put the monitor on immediately, to record on the postcard the date that they put the monitor on, the time that they put the monitor on, and which wrist, their left or their right, they put the monitor on. They then were left to wear it for 8 days and nights. They were told, try and continue doing your normal activity. After those 8 days, return the monitor and the postcard to us. Okay, now in terms of the validity of this particular monitor that we're using, so it was used by or worn by over 100,000 participants in the UK Biobank, and more recently it was worn by over 20,000 participants in the China Kadoorie Biobank. So we know that it can be used in these large cohorts. So the UK Biobank was kind of the pioneering cohort to use accelerometry at scale. And this was run by Aidan Doherty, who's in the Big Data Institute at the University of Oxford. And what him and his team have done is develop this incredible tool, which you can see on the right, so the Biobank Accelerometer Analysis Tool, which is based on like an automated machine learning approach. Basically what it does is it takes this huge amount of raw accelerometer data from large cohorts and extracts meaningful information from that data. So what it does is it tells us the amount of time spent in sort of 4 main 24-hour movement behaviors. So it tells us the amount of time spent sleeping, which is depicted in blue in that graph, the amount of time spent being sedentary, depicted in red, the amount of time spent in light physical activity in orange, and the amount of time spent in MVPA in green. And then the black line that you see is just the amount of acceleration or the amount of movement. So the higher up it is, the more active that person was being. So you can see that the spikes in acceleration correspond to the sections of green, which is when people are doing MVPA. Okay, so we have now finished collecting data for the ELSA accelerometry module. So this is the latest participant flow diagram. I should say these aren't the final figures, they will go up because we've still got data coming in. But 5,295 people were invited to wear an accelerometer. Of those, 4,265 agreed and were actually able to wear a monitor. In terms of reasons for refusal, the sort of 3 main reasons were concerns about the monitor being uncomfortable or concerned about the protocol being too time-consuming, or that they wouldn't be able to wear the monitor at work, for example, for safety reasons. So we now have data back from 3,870. Again, we expect this to increase. And of these participants, 3,286 had what we're saying is sufficient wear time. And in this case, we're using the same quality control criteria as the UK Biobank. So they're said to have sufficient wear time if they wore the monitor for 3 or more days and had contribution in each 1-hour period of the 24-hour cycle. And so this, the amount with sufficient wear time corresponded to a pretty high adherence rate of 85%. Now, in terms of sort of the practical issues that may have impacted adherence, I think the main one was the limited recording time of the monitor. So there's sort of 2 main take-homes. The first thing is that, and this is for anybody that's thinking of using accelerometers in any studies, I didn't realize this, but when you use a monitor for the very first time, it has like a suboptimal battery life. So we found that at the start that we sent out these monitors that were brand new, that were fully charged, and after 3 or 4 days, they just stopped recording. Fortunately, I checked the data early on and discovered this, contacted Activity, and basically you have to do a practice run-through before sending them out. So we just set them to record in a box in the office, removed the data, recharged. When we sent it back out, then they had normal battery life. So that's one sort of huge tip if anyone's thinking of using them in the future. The other issue with the limited recording time is that when you give out a monitor in person, you know that that person has started wearing it immediately. So yes, they might take it off early, but we don't have that issue of when did they put it on. Whereas with posting, we didn't know when they actually put it on. We just had to hope that it arrived 2 days after we posted it and that they did put it on straight away. We allowed for those 3 extra days, so we allowed for them to be 3 days late, but if they were any more than 3 days late, then obviously the monitor would have stopped recording before they'd reached 7 full days of wear. In terms of other things that may have impacted adherence, people ask about adverse events. We had very, very few reports of adverse events. All of those were just slight skin irritation, but there were just only a few that wouldn't have impacted adherence. Okay, so now in terms of next steps, what we're going to do with this data. So the first thing is we're writing up a paper describing the ELSA accelerometry methods, similar to what has already been done for the UK Biobank and is currently being done for the China Kadoorie Biobank. Then, either at the same time or shortly after, we're going to then release the data. And again, we're going to follow sort of a similar model to the UK Biobank. They released 3 different types of data. So they released just the raw data, which for an activity is a .cwa file. They then have this sort of like intermediate data, which is where they've condensed that raw data into short time windows or epochs, so into 5-second segments of activity. And then finally, we'll release the summary data, which is probably the data that is going to appear to be the most meaningful. I'll see, you might have to, I don't have a Mac. So this is the summary data that was released for the UK Biobank, and we'll be doing something very similarly. So, like I said, with that automated machine learning approach, it classified movement into those different 24-hour movement behaviors. And so what we'll be releasing is averages for each of those 24-hour movement behaviors. So if I just give an example of sedentary behavior. So you can see for UK Biobank, they had over 100,000 people that had data on overall average sedentary time. So the way they reported it is they reported it as the percentage of the day spent being sedentary. So this value here, so 0.38, needs to be multiplied by 24 in order to then get a value for the average number of hours per day spent being sedentary. You might have to know. Sorry. Yeah. So in the UK Biobank, participants spent on average 9.1 hours per day sleeping, 9.1 hours per day being sedentary, 4.8 hours per day engaging in light physical activity, and 42 minutes per day spent in MBPA. So we'll be reporting or providing similar summary statistics for the ELSA data. They're also going to be doing the same for the China Kadoorie Biobank. Okay, so now a little bit about so I'm employed at UCL to be implementing accelerometry for the first time in ELSA. And this is part of a larger collaborative grant between UCL and Peking University. So the grant is funded by the ESRC and the National Science Foundation of China. And the overarching aim of that grant is to compare the impact of lifestyle factors, and specifically physical activity and sleep, on cognitive aging and dementia in England and in China. So we're implementing accelerometry for the first time here in England. They're also doing the same in China. So there's an equivalent study called CHARLES, the China Health and Retirement Longitudinal Study, which is a nationally representative cohort study of the Chinese population aged 45 years and older. And as I said, they're also implementing wrist-worn accelerometry for the first time in this latest wave. So CHARLES started after ELSA. It started in 2011, but similar to ELSA, they have waves approximately every 2 years. They're currently on wave 5. So this is the latest participant flow diagram for CHARLES. Again, these aren't final figures because they're going to go back into the field and get people that didn't have sufficient wear time to wear it again. But the numbers are huge, so this is a really amazing source of data. So 16,884 participants were invited to wear a monitor, 12,835 agreed, so a response rate of 76%. They have data back from 12,446, and of that, 11,807 had sufficient wear time. Their definition of sufficient wear time is slightly different to ours, so they've said that they just needed at least 1 day of wear, but it's a huge adherence rate of 95%. So this is all absolutely fantastic. There's just one slight snag, I guess, is that the team over in China decided to use a different brand of wrist-worn accelerometer to the one that we're using here in ELSA. So as I've already said, in ELSA we're using the Accelerometry AX3, which is this well-established monitor that's been used in the UK Biobank and the China Kadoorie Biobank. But the Charles team have double the number of participants and felt as though that monitor was too expensive. So that monitor is £100 per unit. So they decided, no, that's too much, so we're going to make our own. And they've managed in like record-breaking time to make their own monitor, which is half the price and has additional functionalities. So it's not just a triaxial accelerometer, so it doesn't just measure acceleration up, down, side to side, front to back. It also measures rotation around each of those axes, and it measures heart rate. So it measures heart rate either like continuously, or you can set it to measure every 5, 10, or 15 minutes. So this is potentially a really exciting option for future large cohort studies, particularly those in low or middle income countries, because it is a lot cheaper and it has those extra functionalities. But is it any good? And how does it compare to the one that we're using in ELSA? So I've just finished doing this free living validation study, doing that here in England, but they are doing the same thing over in China. So basically we got 85 English adults aged 50 years and older, so the same demographic as the ELSA participants, but not ELSA participants. We got them to wear both monitors at the same time for 8 days and nights. The positional order of the two monitors was randomized, so half the participants wore the Chinese matrix monitor closer to their wrist, and the other half wore the Accelerometry monitor closer to their wrist. So these, I should just say, are preliminary analysis of the first 72 participants, because I've only just got the data back. But when we compare overall acceleration average, which is the sort of foundational physical activity metric used in the UK Biobank, the values are very, very similar, thank God, between the Accelerometry and the matrix. So the intra-class correlation coefficient is 0.96, with a 95% confidence interval of 0.87 to 0.98. So I think at this point, we feel fairly confident that they are functionally equivalent monitors, and therefore that data from those two monitors can be harmonized for cross-cohort comparisons, which is, yeah, very reassuring. This is the final slide to say an additional component of that validation study was that we got people to wear a wearable camera for 1 waking day, and also to complete a sleep diary around that camera wear day, so the evening before the camera wear day, the morning and evening of the camera wear day, and the morning after the camera wear day. And this relates to that automated machine learning approach that they're using in Oxford for the UK Biobank and the China Kadoorie Biobank. We are going to train our own model, either one model that will be used in ELSA and Charles, or choose separate models, one for ELSA and one for Charles. In order to train that model, we need to know what the participant was actually doing. And so with a camera, it takes images every 20 seconds, and we can see, okay, I can confirm that that person was in their car. And that will be used to train these new models that we'll use to analyze the ELSA and the Charles data. Okay, that's enough from me, but let me know if you have any questions.
Did you notice any particular kind of selection into participation and adherence?
We haven't looked at that, but I can, based on the evidence, I think an issue is that people that are more active are going to be more likely to say yes to wearing a monitor. I think another thing is that we tell people to try and to live their life normally. but most people will be more active than they would normally be. It's almost an intervention in itself, that they wear this thing that they know measures their activity, so they are more active. So that is a limitation of that, yeah.
Can I ask something like following this?
Mm-hmm.
Did you find any discrepancies with aging people, like aging population? Like older people were less likely to wear it, or they found more difficulties?
So we haven't. So at the minute we haven't matched the accelerometer data with the demographic data, but that's what we will be putting in that description paper. We'll be looking at differences by various different demographics. I would imagine that you would see that fewer older people would wear it, but yeah, we haven't looked at that yet.
Do you have a sense of what proportion you expect to reach the recommended threshold? Have you had any just some big number you've got some?
I reckon the 5 to 10% mark is probably about right, but we'll see. So 150 minutes of MVPA per week. So in the UK Biobank, the average was 42 minutes. 42 minutes per day, which would definitely be meeting the recommendations, but that was a younger cohort. So, yeah.
Super interesting topic. Unfortunately, I know nothing about it, so I have a very naive question.
Okay.
Can you use this data to study actual sleeping patterns?
We hope so. So I feel like at the minute, I'm just looking at sleep duration, but the team in Oxford are also developing machine learning models to look a little bit more in depth about sleep. But I think if I'm honest, if you want to capture sleep in more detail, you need to use polysomnography rather than accelerometry. Most polysomnography is taking place like in a lab, but studies are now starting to use at-home polysomnography, which I think if you're really interested in sort of the finer details of sleep, you probably need to be using that. But you can get some interesting indicators of sleep from accelerometry.